Hello, my friends. Welcome to Origins. My name is Don Chapman. It's my privilege to be your host. Origins is a forum where we take the evidence of science and use it to validate the truth of creation. And we usually do that by having guests with us who have some background in science, and that's certainly the case today. What a privilege to have with us Dr. Danny Faulkner. Dr. Faulkner, how good to have you.
Thank you.
Now, we're going to talk today about science. We're going to talk about the whole story behind science. A little bit of history, a little bit of science today. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's exciting. I love to understand how modern science came into being. So we start with one of the most basic of all scientific questions. Which came first, the chicken or the egg?
Yeah, you know, it's supposed to be an imponderable question, Don, where there's no real answer. But there really is an answer, and it's very simple. And the answer depends upon your presuppositions. If you are a creationist, you believe that God made a couple of chickens and they then laid eggs and produced other chickens. But if you're an evolutionist, you think a non-chicken laid an egg that then hatched into a chicken from which we get other chickens.
It's nonsensical to believe he made all these other animals and then made an egg instead of a chicken.
That's right.
Yeah, absolutely.
But if you're an evolutionist, you have to believe the egg came first.
Well, now that we've solved that great problem, let's take an easy question like, what is science?
What is science? All right. Well, science, the way I learned it growing up, was defined to be the study of the natural world using the five senses. Now, already there are some limitations placed on science. If it's not natural or physical, then it's not science. You know, love is not natural or physical. It's, you see, God isn't, angels aren't, those kind of things. So there's not really scientific issues we can discuss scientifically.
Could I add it, and just to see if you're on the same page, the spiritual dimension of man?
That's right.
Love
touches upon that in our relationship
yes,
to God.
But there's a part of us that doesn't fit in the test.
Goes beyond the physical, beyond the natural.
That's right.
But even if something's natural or physical, if you can't study with the five senses, you can't see it, smell it, hear it, taste it, or touch it, then it's not really science either.
Right. So that's been a definition for several hundred years.
At least one I grew up with. It's been changed in recent years. I'll come back to that in a little bit and discuss what's going on there.
So how are we doing today?
Most people think of science and Christianity, and the Bible in particular, kind of butting heads. You've got evolution on one side, which is considered to be science, and creation to consider to be a faith or religious issue. But you know, we've got a lot of confusion here, because the problem is we use science two different ways. There's what we call operational science. This is something that works today and operates in the world today. We can test it like a theory of gravity. You can go into a lab, you can rig up an experiment and conduct that experiment and see if your results agree with your theory. That's the way we confirm our models or theories in science. It's also repeatable. I can come up with a new theory about something, I can test it in the lab, I can write it up, another scientist can do the same experiment or a slightly different experiment in another lab at another time at another place.
It's always repeatable.
Repeatable and testable in today's world. Now, we have what we call historical or origin science. And this is using some scientific principles to make a guess about what kind of things might have happened in the past. Now, right away, you'll see that you can't test that directly. If you have an idea about a crime scene, for instance, you can kind of use scientific principles to piece together what could have happened in the past. But since the crime scene many times has been altered through the investigation or through the crime itself, you can't go back and exactly repeat it. So it's not repeatable, not testable in the same way that operational science is.
So my question would be, can you verify scientific fact through what you're calling historical science, or can that only be done through operational science?
I think operational science, historical science gives you plausible arguments about past processes.
But not facts.
But not facts. That's exactly the difference.
Yes.
And that's a lot of confusion, because origins, be it creation or evolution, falls under historical science.
Right.
And things like gravity fall under operational science. And the rules of evidence are very different among the two. And you know, we as creationists have no problem with operational science. And that's about 95% of science anyway.
Yes.
It's that other 5% that we have questions
real
about.
Science.
Real science as opposed to false science.
Yes.
or quasi-science.
That's right.
At that point. All right, well, I want to talk a little bit about about some scientific statements and questions. I'd like to begin with this quote by the late Carl Sagan, a very famous astronomer. In his TV show and his book called Cosmos back in 1980 and 81, he wrote, "The cosmos is all there is, all there ever has been, or all there ever will be." And you know, many people look at that and they think, wow, that is a very profound scientific statement. But I would submit to you there's not a bit of science in it. It's actually a metaphysical assertion. It's a faith statement. Notice
It really is. There's nothing in there except him pronouncing his belief.
Yeah, he says the universe or cosmos is all there is, all there ever has been, and all there ever will be. Now, in order to prove that statement to be true, he would have to get outside the universe to see that there's nothing outside the universe. And he'd have to be able to do that at all times in the past and all times in the future. In order to make that statement with certainty, he would have to be God. And you see, this statement actually is a denial that God exists. Very subtle.
Absolutely.
But what he's doing is he's saying that nothing other than the physical, natural world exists. He can't prove that, but that's his working hypothesis.
That's what that is. It's his hypothesis. Mm-hmm. And what it's about is he's really found a positive way to say there's no God.
Yep.
Yeah,
and this has become the way that historical science has developed, unfortunately, in recent years. And so that's a real problem. Again, no science here, just an assertion of his own personal belief about things. Now, we like to go back to the ancient Greeks because they started science early on, not as we know it today. That goes back about 400 years, but certain scientific principles began. They used deductive reasoning. That's using reasoning power starting from general statements to specific conclusions. And they also use inductive reasoning, going from specific examples to general statements. It usually involved astronomy, which is my chosen field, dealing with the motions of the planets, the stars, the sun, the moon, the phase of the moon, and so forth. And I'll give you a couple examples of inductive reasoning from the past dealing with astronomy. First of all, the shape and size of the Earth. People think that it's a very common belief, misconception, that everybody thought the world was flat until 500 years ago at the time of Columbus. Well, it turns out people at least 2,500 years ago knew the world was spherical. Think about that. 2,500 years ago, people knew the world was spherical, and they had different arguments for that. One of them is the fact that when you see a lunar eclipse, the shape of the shadow is always a circle, and only a sphere will cast a circle all the time, regardless of the orientation. Now, there had other arguments too, but that's one of the better ones they had. Then the geocentric theory. This is the dominant theory, the most successful theory of all time. A guy named Ptolemy, back around the 100 AD, put together this elaborate theory with epicycles going around and around to explain the motions of the sun, the moon, and the planets. And that theory persisted for 15 centuries. It was overthrown 400 years ago with the rise of modern science.
The Earth is the center. And
yeah,
everything
Earth is the center, and you're trying to explain the motions of the planets using circles. Wow. And it was a very complex theory which caused its collapse eventually. So a lot of interesting things from the history of science itself. Now, one of the most important people I like to talk about is Sir Francis Bacon. He lived 400 years ago. He was English, and he wrote a book published in 1620, Novum Organum. That's the Latin title, because all this sort of thing was written in Latin back then. It means new instrument. And in that book, and in a book a few years later he published called Leviathan, he put forth the scientific method, the thing you learned in school about hypothesis, and you test and you refine, and so all the steps, all Baconian science that he did. And he's also then the father of the inductive reasoning as well. He started up that idea 4 centuries ago. Everybody knows this except for one thing. What they don't know is that he wrote extensively on theology. You know, he took the Bible very seriously, as did most educated people in Europe at the time. And this is the untold side of Francis Bacon. He invented science, the scientific method, but yet he took the Bible very, very seriously.
Is there a connection?
Absolutely. We'll get to that in just a moment. The view of God made science possible. Yes. Sir Isaac Newton comes along a bit after Bacon. He wrote his Principia. Actually wrote it 20 years earlier, but in 1687 he published it. And in that he laid out calculus, physics, all these sorts of things. He did all the work before he was 22 years old, by the way. In 1704 he publishes optics. So this man invented calculus and he invented physics as we know it. But the thing we don't really understand is the fact that he wrote more than 4 million words on theology. He wrote 10 times as much on theology than he did on math and science combined. So the man was very biblically literate and took the Bible extremely seriously. You know, you don't hear that story today about too many scientists today.
Okay.
And then you find other people, I'll just mention in passing, Copernicus with the heliocentric theory, popularization of that, Galileo with his use of the telescope for astronomy.
Just tell our people what heliocentric means.
That means the sun is the center and the planets, including the Earth, go around the sun.
Right.
Good point. Tycho Brahe, a Danish astronomer who did keen observations that his employee and student Johann Kepler used later to devise his 3 laws of planetary motion. All these people contemporaries roughly with one another 400 or 500 years ago. All these men steeply influenced by Christianity. Copernicus himself was a priest. Galileo wasn't, but he worked within the confines of the church.
Yes.
And Kepler and Tycho they were Protestant, and they had very definite, strong views about Christianity and the Bible. Took the Bible very seriously. Again, the story you don't hear in school very much. Go back to Newton. I got a couple of quotes here, 3 quotes from his Principia. This most beautiful system of the sun, planets, and comets could only proceed from the counsel and dominion of an intelligent and powerful being. Obviously, Newton believed in intelligent design, didn't he? And then this being governs all things, not as the soul of the world, but as Lord over all. And finally, this last quote I want to give you from his Principia. And thus much concerning God, to discourse of whom from the appearances of things does certainly belong to natural philosophy. That's what we called science. We would call science today, they called natural philosophy. These aren't the kind of words you'd find in too many science textbooks today, but this is the founding document of physics and modern astronomy.
Yes.
So obviously Christianity played a very key role in all this. Well, we have Martin Luther a bit before them, establishing the Protestant Reformation, and he taught that all honest work was worthy of honor. You see, before that, the Roman Catholic Church had separated the sacred from the secular. The king and the priests were doing the Lord's work. Everybody else, you were just doing venal, secular sort of work. And the Protestant Reformation said, no, all work, if it's honest, is worthy of honor. So they took the separation between the sacred and the secular apart, and they began to think that they were thinking God's thoughts after him. They were trying to think about how God was making the world work. And they also, I understand Newton, on some of his writings at the end, would publish in Latin beneath that, all to the glory of God. Again, you don't find that kind of sentiment too much in science today. But this is what the founders of science thought. Very different from today. And I think that Christianity, particularly Protestant Christianity, then made science possible. Because you see, our Creator is a God of order. He's not a God of chaos. And He is also a God who is knowable. We can know Him. It's possible to know Him and Him to know us. We can have a relationship with Him. And so the working hypothesis was perhaps this Creator who is knowable and a God of order. Perhaps He imprinted some of those characteristics of knowability and order upon His universe. Mm-hmm. And we're told in the New Testament, for instance, that this current world is sustained by the power of His Word. Well, just what does that mean? Can we reason through and can we discover some of the order that might be there? And so the conclusion or the working hypothesis that people had 4 centuries ago in Protestant Europe was that the world is ordered and it's knowable. And that was a revolutionary idea. Nobody really in the past had thought about that. In the ancient Western deities, the Romans and Greeks with their polytheism, their gods were just supermen. They weren't transcendent, so they didn't really control the way the world worked. And in the Far East, you had the yin and the yang. Things were changing at chance all the time. If you did an experiment today, you wouldn't expect the same result tomorrow or in another place. It's going to change continually all the time. So in those kind of world systems, you would not expect the world to be knowable. You wouldn't expect it to be ordered. And hence, you wouldn't expect it to be predictable. So the 17th century is a neat time because science as we know it began at that time in Northern Europe. And the Bible was taken seriously and was viewed as being authoritative, not only in spiritual matters, we all agree with that, but it also took it seriously in historical matters and even in scientific matters.
When you think of these men, Bacon and Newton, for example, when they're working with their right hand in theology and their left hand in science, obviously their conclusion is that it's one God and it's all true.
And their worldview was unified. They didn't view theology and science as 2 separate things like we often do today.
Right.
And that's really a shame. We've separated the world like we have. Gone back to the Middle Ages, basically, in the separation between the two. And I think a good example of this was Archbishop Usher, And around 1650, he published his Annals of the World, and he took biblical chronology, and for a long time I thought that's what he only used, but I have a copy of the book, by the way. It's been republished, translated again out of the Latin into English, and he took every possible chronology he could find, secular and biblical, and collated them, and came up with a date of about 4000 BC for the origin of the world. And he wasn't the only one doing it. That was a rage in Europe. Everybody was doing it. Johann Kepler had his own chronology, and he had about a 7,000-year chronology rather than 6,000 years, but most were 6,000 years. And at that point, the Bible was taken as a reliable, historical, scientific document. And that's very different from what we have today, obviously.
Folks, we have to take a break, but you'll want to stay with us. Dr. Faulkner will be helping us understand what happened that took us from this Bible as the basis and Christianity as a basis for all of scientific discovery to where we are today, where, again, the Bible is viewed as mythology and irrelevant to the study of science. So don't you go away. We'll be right back.
Creation versus evolution. You weigh the evidence. Random mutations, fabulous fossil folly. According to evolutionists, we exist because random mutations turn simple organisms into more complex creatures. If so, where are all the leftovers and mistakes? Where are all the fossils showing evolution? Through the years, we've been exposed to many hoaxes, but we haven't found one evolutionary fossil. Instead, we see millions of fossils that actually indicate creation of many distinctly different species at one time. Today's guest on Origins, Dr. Danny Faulkner, is also the author of Universe by Design, an explanation of cosmology and creation. This is an excellent book for upper-level homeschool curriculum or the library of an astronomer. Orders are being taken at 1-877-CRS-BOOK. Dr. Faulkner has a degree in math, his master's in physics, and a PhD in astronomy from Indiana University. He is full professor at the University of South Carolina, Lancaster, where he teaches physics and astronomy. For more information about our guest, you can write to Dr. Danny Faulkner, 1402 University Drive, Lancaster, South Carolina, 29720. Or send him an email.
We're back with Dr. Danny Faulkner, and when we left, we had just left with Archbishop Usher, and you were telling us how basically it was 17th century Protestant theology that laid the foundation for modern science. Is that a fair statement?
That's correct.
And the Bible was viewed as an authoritative book to use in the working of science?
Yes.
Obviously, that's not where we are today in the secular world in which we live. What happened?
Yeah, something terrible happened, right?
Something went wrong.
So the question is,
yeah.
What happened? Well, my understanding is that the so-called Enlightenment of the 17th century happened.
Yes.
Now, you know, in school, I'm sure you were taught the same way. I was taught the Enlightenment was this great thing. There was all this superstition and Dark Ages, and the Dark Ages were coined. That term was coined at that time. They had to really do a hatchet job on the Middle Ages. And medieval scholars, by the way, don't like that because the Dark Ages weren't nearly as dark as people think that they were.
Right.
So they had to really diss everything. This idea of the flat earth that was invented then just to make people in the past seem ignorant and superstitious. So Enlightenment comes along and they hijack science. Man's using his mind now, using his reasoning ability to understand the world. And that made man's mind important and above everything else. Up to that point, people had their minds below the authority of God and Scripture. They still use their minds. Again, the Enlightenment tries to tell you otherwise.
Under the authority of God. I like that.
As opposed to its being authority to itself.
Right.
And so when the Enlightenment comes along, man becomes all important. That's led to humanism. Not humanitarianism, but humanism.
Man is the ultimate.
That's right. And then it left to this idea that God does not exist. That's atheism. You know, before the Enlightenment, you had a hard time finding anybody in the West who believed in atheism.
It takes a lot of education for a fool to know in his heart there's no God. Yes.
That's right. And it led to another belief of God is irrelevant. That's deism. You know, God started everything, but then He withdraws. And you never heard of these things, humanism, atheism, and deism, until the Enlightenment began to have its terrible effect upon the world. And so then the next century, you have Origin of Species published by Charles Darwin in 1859, and the world was ready for that. England was ready at that point. And what sadly happened is the church, starting in England, largely accommodated this. They begin to accommodate billions of years. They begin to accommodate evolutionary processes. They begin to let it come in. The church had never done that before.
Now, again, I know we could do a whole show on this, but in a nutshell, why does the church accommodate it? Why doesn't the church stick to biblical truth?
I think they simply want to be respected. They want to get along. They want to be thought of as being smart and with it sort of people.
They're afraid that what's modern now is going to disprove the truth, so they adapt.
They adapt to the truth, the new truth as it is.
Which isn't the truth at all.
It's a falsehood entirely.
And doesn't that still happen today?
All the time.
Mainline denominations today and so forth,
The compromise really started at this point on all of this. Oh, by the way, the secular and the sacred were divorced once again. In the Middle Ages, the Dark Ages, you had the Roman Catholic Church separated the two. Right. And then during the Protestant Reformation, we bring the two back together again. Right. And son of a gun, in modern times, we pull them apart again. Right. And so we're right back to the Middle Ages.
And there were some tremendous benefits when we brought those together.
Yes.
The dignity of work, the foundation of capitalism, and a dozen other things that we brought in when we said, God is Lord of it all. In everything we do, we can do to the glory of God.
That's right.
Yeah, and we lost that again in the Enlightenment.
We lost that in the Enlightenment. So-called Enlightenment.
Yes.
I like to put so-called in front of it.
The historical.
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
So, remember the definition of science, the study of the natural world using the five senses. Well, they've now scratched that definition. This is in my lifetime, I've seen this take place. The definition has changed so that now it's the search for natural explanations. Okay. That again gets back to Carl Sagan's statement, you're going to automatically exclude any possibility of anything beyond the natural or physical world. Now, Don, what happens if something doesn't have a natural explanation?
That's right.
You make one up. And if you make one up, no matter how cockeyed or concocted the explanation may be, if the only other alternative is creation or a creator, then you have to accept the really strange one because you've eliminated the other possibility.
And isn't evolution absolutely fraught with explanations that if you just take them on their face, they're absolutely silly?
Yeah, they are.
But they are presented with a straight face because the alternative would be God, and we're not going there.
That's exactly what the stakes are there.
Uh-huh.
And this has had a bad effect upon science, I believe. Again, we're going back to the ancient world again. You have no reason why the world should be ordered. There's a quote attributed to Albert Einstein, where he said the most incomprehensible thing about the world is that the world is comprehensible. Well, you know, someone like Newton or Bacon would have said, well, you dummy, of course it is. That's what we expect. Right. But to the modern mind, where there is no God of order behind the universe, then you wouldn't expect that to happen. And some writers refer to this order as God, small lowercase g, God. And my big concern is that science has lost its foundation. We've drifted away from what science originally was, and even more importantly, theism has become unwelcome. What I think our position as creation scientists ought to be is, first of all, the Bible is reliable, despite what modern man seems to think. The Bible is inerrant, and it's good for us to use in all authorities in all matters. And the Bible is historically accurate. And you know, get back to Usher, wasn't a perfect man, but he really had some right ideas, a good foundation. And this all changed during the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment made all these other things, such as atheism, acceptable, and then became mandatory, and made skepticism respectable. And ultimately what we're trying to do is turn back the clock and have a restoration of what science was originally supposed to be. So we're the ones that want to go back to basic science.
Now when you say we, who are you talking about?
We creation scientists.
Creation scientists are going back to the foundational truths that were discovered in the 17th century.
That's it.
And we're building real science that is fact-based and verifiable.
That's exactly it.
And it leads us back to God's Word.
That's exactly right.
I appreciate the fact that God's given our church people like you. Keep up the good work and keep speaking the truth. And I know God's going to bless your work. And God isn't done yet. He's going to redeem science yet. I'm so delighted that you've joined us for Origins. I'm so thankful that God has made wonderful people like Dr. Faulkner who will come and share the truth of what real science is. I hope that you have an open mind and that you'll listen to the truth and that you'll look for facts and truth, and you'll understand that God's Word always proves true. And above all, remember this: It's God's view that He created you, and that should be your worldview too. Hope to see you again soon here on Origins. Until then, God bless you, my friend.
Thank you for watching this edition of Origins. If you'd like a copy of the PowerPoint information presented today, you can download a PDF file of program number 904 from our website at www.originstv.org. Or for a DVD of this series, send a $12 donation to cover shipping and handling and write to Origins, program number 904, Cornerstone Television, Wall, Pennsylvania 15148.
Origins is made possible by the faithful prayers and the financial support of you, our Cornerstone Television family.